History is not only written in ink, it is written in hunger, silence, and rage. Behind grand plantations and polished dining tables, there were screams that never reached the records. Tonight's story lives in that darkness, where excess met starvation, where power grew fat while suffering grew thin, and where one unheard woman decided that silence would no longer protect anyone. The plantation existed as a living contradiction, a place where abundance and starvation shared the same walls, but never the same bodies. On one side stood the main house, tall and proud, its wooden floors polished, its rooms heavy with the smell of cooked meat, butter, and sugar. Long tables bent under the weight of excess, plates refilled before they were emptied, cups never allowed to run dry. Food was not just nourishment here, it was a display of dominance, a silent announcement that power had the right to consume without limit. The master's meals stretched for hours, his appetite praised as a sign of prosperity, his expanding body treated as proof of success rather than decay. Just beyond this world of indulgence lay another reality, one deliberately hidden from polite conversation. The enslaved quarters were cramped, dark, and thin with life. Hunger lived there permanently, not as a passing discomfort, but as a constant companion. Stomachs growled through the night, children learned early how to ignore pain, and adults measured days not by sunlight, but by how long they could endure emptiness. Rations were controlled with cruelty, reduced as punishment, withheld as warning. The same hands that carried overflowing platters to the master returned to their quarters with crumbs, sometimes nothing at all. The contrast was not accidental, it was engineered. Every bite the master took while watching the enslaved work on empty stomachs reinforced his sense of control. Hunger weakened bodies, slowed resistance, and broke spirits more efficiently than chains. The master understood this well. His obesity became symbolic, a physical manifestation of stolen labor and stolen lives. Flesh layered upon flesh as years passed, each added pound representing another season of forced work, another harvest wrung from suffering hands. His body absorbed what others were denied. The enslaved woman at the center of this story lived inside this imbalance every day. She moved between worlds that could not be more different, carrying trays from kitchens bursting with food into rooms where laughter and chewing filled the air. She saw grease drip from meat onto fine cloth, while she memorized how hunger twisted the body, how dizziness crept in when standing too long, how weakness could be mistaken for obedience. Her senses were tortured daily by smells she could not escape and tastes she was never allowed to know. She watched how excess changed the master. His movements grew slower, his temper shorter, his dependence on others greater. He needed help to rise, to dress, to move through the house, yet his cruelty did not soften. Instead, it sharpened. Perhaps he sensed his own physical decline and compensated with harsher commands, louder insults, more frequent punishments. The imbalance between his bloated body and her shrinking one felt like an unspoken mockery, a silent cruelty that went beyond words or whips. At night, hunger refused to let her sleep. It pressed against her ribs, made her thoughts wander into dangerous territory. She remembered times before captivity, or stories told by elders about lives where food did not belong to one man alone. These memories clashed violently with her present reality, where abundance existed only as something to serve, never to share. Each day she survived felt like an insult to nature itself, where one human body expanded endlessly, while another was expected to disappear quietly. The plantation relied on this imbalance to function. Overseers turned a blind eye, the master encouraged it, and fear kept it alive. Starvation was woven into the system like a rule no one questioned. The enslaved learned to hide hunger, to mask weakness, to keep working even as their bodies protested. The master, meanwhile, consumed more, believing his comfort was proof that the system worked exactly as intended. But imbalance creates pressure, and pressure seeks release. The longer this contrast existed, the more unstable it became. Every shared space, every carried plate, every glance at the master's swollen form added weight to something unseen but growing. Hunger sharpened perception, it taught patience, it trained the mind to observe details others missed. While the master ate without thought, the woman learned patterns, timings, habits, moments of vulnerability hidden beneath layers of flesh and false security. This grotesque contrast between abundance and starvation was not merely background to the story, it was the force that shaped everything that followed. It stripped humanity from one side while inflating false superiority on the other. It turned food into a weapon and the body into a battleground. In this world, eating was an act of power, and not eating was an act of survival. The imbalance fed itself endlessly, growing more extreme with each passing day, until the space between excess and deprivation became so vast that it could no longer exist without consequence. As the years passed, the master's body became a reflection of his inner corruption, swelling not only with food, but with unchecked authority. His obesity was not the result of comfort alone, but of entitlement so deeply rooted that he no longer recognized limits. He ate because he could, because no one dared deny him, because every meal was another reminder that his desires mattered more than the lives sustaining them. His size became a spectacle within the plantation, spoken of in hushed tones, his heavy footsteps echoing through halls built by hands he barely acknowledged. With every added pound, his dependence on others increased, yet his cruelty intensified rather than softened. He could no longer move freely without assistance, but the loss of physical strength only drove him to assert dominance in other ways. Orders were barked louder, punishments delivered more frequently, and humiliation became a favored tool. He derived satisfaction from reminding the enslaved that even as his body weakened, his power remained absolute. His chair became a throne, his dining table an altar where obedience was reinforced daily. The master's decay was not limited to flesh. His mind grew warped by indulgence, dulled by excess, and poisoned by the belief that suffering was necessary to maintain order. He laughed at pain, dismissed illness as laziness, and treated death as an inconvenience rather than a consequence. His wealth insulated him from reality, allowing him to view human beings as extensions of his property rather than lives capable of breaking. Each cruel decision made it easier to justify the next, until cruelty itself became routine. Those around him noticed the change, though none dared speak of it openly. Overseers adjusted their behavior, aware that the master's moods had become unpredictable. A slight delay in food, a perceived disrespect, or even silence could trigger violent outbursts. His swollen body housed a volatile spirit, one that lashed out to compensate for its own fragility. The more his health declined, the more he clung to control, as though dominance could substitute for vitality. The enslaved woman observed all of this closely. From her position near the center of the household, she witnessed how decay crept into every corner of his existence. She saw the strain in his breathing, the tremor in his hands, the moments of discomfort he tried to mask with anger. She noticed how he lingered longer at the table, how food seemed to be both his comfort and his curse. Each bite he consumed appeared to tether him further to the chair, even as he pretended to rule from it. His obsession with eating became ritualistic. Meals followed strict schedules, and any disruption was treated as a personal attack. He demanded variety, richness, and abundance, regardless of season or cost. The enslaved worked harder to satisfy his cravings, forced to produce more while receiving less themselves. This imbalance fed his sense of superiority, convincing him that his survival and pleasure justified every ounce of suffering inflicted in their pursuit. Yet beneath the surface, fear quietly took root within him. His body betrayed him daily, reminding him that power could not shield him from decline. This fear transformed into suspicion. He watched the enslaved with narrowed eyes, searching for threats where none had yet emerged. His paranoia grew alongside his waistline, blinding him to the consequences of his actions. He believed fear alone would protect him, unaware that fear, when sustained too long, evolves into something far more dangerous. The plantation became a place ruled by a man at war with his own mortality. His grotesque physical state mirrored a moral collapse so complete that compassion no longer existed within him. He mistook obedience for loyalty and silence for acceptance. The enslaved woman, however, recognized the truth. She saw that his strength was an illusion, propped up by violence and excess, and that beneath it lay vulnerability, masked by rage. His decay was slow but relentless, visible to those forced into his presence every day. Each strained breath, each pained movement, each furious outburst revealed cracks in the image of invincibility he worked so hard to maintain. While he believed his size made him untouchable, it instead anchored him, binding him to habits and routines he could not abandon. His world narrowed to the space between his chair and his table, while his cruelty filled the gaps. This moral and physical deterioration poisoned the plantation atmosphere, creating a tension that never fully settled. Every command carried desperation, every meal carried denial, and every act of violence carried the weight of a man trying to outrun his own collapse. The enslaved woman absorbed these details quietly, understanding that decay leaves traces, patterns, and moments where power falters, and that even the most feared figure can become a prisoner of his own excess. The enslaved woman lived in a state of constant observation, though no one ever noticed how closely she watched. Silence had become her shield long ago, a way to survive in a place where words invited punishment. She learned to lower her eyes, to soften her steps, to move through rooms like a shadow that belonged to the house, but was never acknowledged as human. Yet behind that practiced obedience, her mind remained sharp, collecting details others dismissed as meaningless. Every day added another layer of understanding, another piece of knowledge shaped by pain. Her life had been reduced to routine, but routine can become a teacher. She knew the sound of the master's breathing from across the room, could tell by its rhythm whether his mood would be calm or violent. She memorized the times he slept deepest, when his indulgence weighed him down and his guards grew careless. She noticed how servants were rotated, how supervision weakened during certain hours, how excess always led to vulnerability. These observations were not intentional at first, only instincts sharpened by survival, but over time they formed something more deliberate. Years of hunger stripped away illusions. Hope, as she once knew it, had been starved out of her, replaced by a quiet endurance that frightened even her. She had watched others break, some collapsing under punishment, others surrendering their spirit long before their bodies failed. She refused to let that happen to her. Instead, she learned to endure by thinking, by remembering, by refusing to disappear inside herself. Her body weakened, but her awareness grew stronger, fueled by every injustice she witnessed. The master rarely looked at her face. To him, she was part of the furniture, an extension of the plates she carried and the floor she cleaned. That invisibility became her greatest advantage. While his eyes slid past her, she studied him openly. She watched his hands shake when lifting heavy food, the way frustration flickered across his face when his body betrayed him. She saw how power had made him careless, convinced that fear alone was enough to keep everyone beneath him forever. Her anger did not burn loudly, it smoldered. Rage, when expressed openly, was punished quickly, but rage held quietly could survive. She carried it with her through long days and restless nights, letting it harden rather than explode. Hunger sharpened it further, transforming it from emotion into focus. Every insult, every slap, every command added weight, pressing her closer to a limit she did not yet fully understand. She thought often about choice, a concept denied to her in every visible way. Where to sleep, when to eat, how to live, all had been decided by others. Yet inside her mind, choice still existed. Thoughts remained free, even when bodies were owned. That freedom, small as it seemed, became dangerous. It allowed her to imagine outcomes, to consider consequences, to recognize that obedience did not guarantee safety, only delay. The realization settled slowly but firmly. Survival did not always mean submission. The plantation was full of stories whispered in darkness, warnings passed between breaths, tales of punishment meant to terrify, but also stories of resistance that refused to die completely. She listened carefully, separating exaggeration from truth. She learned what had failed before and why. Fear kept most from acting, but fear also taught caution. She understood that whatever path she might take, it could not be rushed, could not be careless, could not resemble desperation. Her observation extended beyond the master. She watched the rhythms of the house, the habits of overseers, the way power shifted subtly depending on mood and circumstance. She noticed when cruelty peaked and when complacency crept in. Excess created patterns, and patterns created openings. The master's indulgence dulled his senses, narrowed his awareness, and bound him to predictability. Where others saw only danger, she began to see structure. Inside her, something changed. She stopped seeing herself solely as a victim of circumstance and began to see herself as a witness to opportunity. Not opportunity for escape, which felt impossible, but for disruption. The thought frightened her at first. It challenged everything she had done to survive. Yet the idea returned again and again, uninvited but persistent, growing stronger each time hunger twisted her body and injustice filled her sight. She did not speak of it. Silence protected the fragile shape forming in her mind. To reveal it, even indirectly, would destroy it. Instead, she continued to serve, continued to bow her head, continued to appear small. Each act of submission became deliberate rather than forced, a performance designed to maintain invisibility. Beneath that surface, awareness tightened its grip, patience deepened, and resolve slowly took form. What others mistook for weakness was calculation. What appeared as resignation was endurance sharpened into purpose. Years of being overlooked had trained her to exist without acknowledgement, and now that invisibility gave her freedom to think without interference. The master believed she was broken beyond will, unaware that pressure had not destroyed her, only compressed her into something dense and dangerous, shaped by suffering, silence, and the long, unbearable wait for a moment when observation would finally become action. The decision did not arrive suddenly, nor did it feel dramatic in the way stories often pretend such moments are. It emerged quietly, shaped by years of restraint and observation, growing clearer each time her body was denied what it needed to survive. Hunger had long stopped being only physical. It had become emotional, mental, and spiritual, eroding fear and replacing it with a cold understanding that endurance alone would never change her fate. There came a point where survival without dignity felt indistinguishable from a slow disappearance. She weighed the risks without illusion. She knew the consequences of defiance, had seen them carved into other bodies and carried away in silence. Pain no longer frightened her in the way it once had. Familiarity had stripped it of its power. What terrified her more was the certainty that nothing would ever improve if nothing was done. Each day repeated the same cruelty, the same imbalance, the same quiet theft of life, measured in calories denied and years stolen. The future, if left untouched, looked identical to the past. Her thoughts returned again and again to the master's habits, to the rituals that governed his comfort. Excess had made him predictable. His indulgence dictated his schedule. His weakness determined his movements, and his arrogance blinded him to threats that did not announce themselves loudly. She understood that power built on fear often overlooks patience. Violence was expected to be chaotic, desperate, and obvious. Anything calm and calculated slipped beneath notice. She did not think of herself as brave. Courage implied choice, and her choices had been taken long ago. What remained was resolve, born from necessity rather than heroism. The decision was less about revenge than about balance, a response to years of measured cruelty. She was not trying to reclaim justice, a concept that no longer existed in her world. She was responding to pressure the only way pressure eventually allows. Timing mattered more than emotion. She waited, allowing the plan to refine itself through repetition and memory. Every detail was rehearsed silently, every possible interruption considered. Hunger sharpened her focus rather than clouding it. Her body ached, but her mind remained steady, anchored by the certainty that hesitation would only prolong suffering. The act itself became less terrifying than the thought of continuing as before. Around her, the plantation continued as if nothing were about to change. Laughter drifted from the main house, plates clattered, orders were shouted and obeyed. Normalcy masked instability. The master's indulgence reached its usual excess, his body heavy, his awareness dulled by satisfaction. Comfort bred carelessness, and carelessness opened space for what had been quietly forming for years. No alarms rang, no intuition warned him. He had mistaken control for invulnerability for too long. Her hands did not tremble as much as she had expected. They moved with a calm born of repetition, performing tasks she had done countless times before. Familiar motions became something else entirely, transformed by intention. She felt detached, as if watching herself from a distance, aware that once the line was crossed there would be no return. That knowledge did not stop her. It clarified everything. In that moment, she was not thinking of history or legacy or meaning. She thought of hunger, of nights spent listening to her own stomach twist in pain. She thought of the master's laughter, his full mouth issuing commands between bites. She thought of the imbalance that had defined her existence, of how one body had been allowed to grow endlessly while others were expected to shrink and vanish. The act was not impulsive. It was the final point in a long sequence of cause and effect. Fear still existed, but it no longer ruled her. It sat quietly beside determination, no longer strong enough to dictate her actions. Years of silence had trained her to act without announcing herself, to move without being noticed, to exist without acknowledgement. Now that same invisibility carried her forward. The plantation's routines designed to maintain order instead provided cover. Systems built on exploitation rarely imagine resistance emerging from within their own rhythms. She understood that the act would not free her, that nothing about the world beyond that moment would suddenly become kind. There would be consequences beyond imagining, yet the knowledge did not deter her. Some decisions are made not because they promise survival, but because they restore agency, even briefly. To act, even once, was to refuse erasure. As the moment unfolded, it felt less like an explosion and more like a release, pressure finally escaping after years of containment. The weight she carried did not vanish, but it shifted, no longer crushing her entirely. Whatever followed would be faced without regret. The unthinkable act was not born from madness or loss of control, but from clarity sharpened by suffering, a single choice forged by years of being denied every other one. What followed did not unfold with the chaos many might imagine, but with a heavy, unnatural stillness that settled over the plantation like a suffocating fog. The act had been done, and in its wake, time seemed to hesitate, as if the world itself struggled to understand what had just occurred. The usual sounds of abundance, laughter, and command were interrupted by silence that felt louder than any scream. The master's authority, once absolute, now existed only as memory and shock, its sudden absence exposing how fragile it had always been. Whispers moved faster than footsteps. Servants noticed changes before words could form, sensing that something fundamental had shifted. Fear spread not only among the enslaved, but also among those who believed themselves protected by hierarchy. The idea that such an act could occur within the heart of the household shattered the illusion of complete control. Power had always relied on distance, on the belief that those beneath it were incapable of decisive action. That belief now lay broken. The enslaved woman became something undefined in the minds of others. To some, she was a warning, a living reminder that desperation could produce consequences no system could fully contain. To others, she was a symbol of suppressed rage finally given form. Her name, whether known or not, mattered less than what she represented. She embodied the fear every master avoided acknowledging, that oppression does not erase will, it compresses it. Reactions varied, but none could undo what had been done. Authority scrambled to reassert itself, to restore order through punishment and spectacle. Yet even as control tightened, something irreversible had taken place. The plantation could no longer pretend to be immune to resistance. Silence among the enslaved grew heavier, no longer empty but charged with possibility. Eyes met differently, conversations paused longer, and obedience carried a new undertone of awareness. The story spread beyond the plantation, carried by rumor and distortion. Some versions exaggerated, others minimized, but all carried the same unsettling core. A line had been crossed. The narrative comfort of invincibility had been disrupted. For those invested in maintaining the system, the tale became a threat that needed to be controlled, reshaped, or buried. For those living under its weight, it became proof that power was not absolute. The woman herself was no longer seen as invisible. Her existence now demanded recognition, though that recognition came wrapped in fear and consequence. Whatever fate awaited her, it would be harsh, but it could not erase what she had already altered. The system could punish a body, but it could not fully reclaim the certainty it had lost. The act lingered in memory, refusing to settle into neat explanation. In the years that followed, the story did not fade as quickly as others had. It endured because it unsettled both sides of the divide. It challenged the comforting belief that suffering naturally produces submission. It forced acknowledgement that endurance can transform into resistance when pushed beyond its limit. The plantation and others like it continued to function, but the sense of unquestioned dominance had been fractured. For some, the tale became a cautionary whisper, passed down as a reminder to tighten control, to never grow complacent. For others, it became something quieter but more powerful, an internal affirmation that fear was not the only possible response to cruelty. Even without celebration or acknowledgement, the impact remained, subtle yet persistent. History often prefers clean narratives, heroes clearly defined, villains easily condemned. This story resisted that simplicity. It lived in the uncomfortable space where morality, survival, and desperation collide. The enslaved woman was neither saint nor monster. She was a human being responding to an inhuman system, and that complexity made the story harder to dismiss or forget. Long after the immediate consequences had passed, the memory of the act continued to haunt the idea of absolute power. It served as a reminder that systems built on imbalance carry within them the seeds of their own instability. Excess invites decay, cruelty invites consequence, and silence, when stretched too far, eventually breaks in ways no one can fully predict.